I think I'm in love with my husband and I have no idea what to do next. We got married so he could get health insurance for his cystic fibrosis treatments. Charlie was going to die without medication that cost $18,000 a month, and I worked at a company with incredible health benefits that covered spouses. My coworker mentioned her brother's best friend was about to age out of his parents' insurance, and the treatments keeping him alive would bankrupt his family in 2 months. He was planning to just stop treatment and die rather than destroy his parents' retirement savings. I couldn't stop thinking about someone choosing death over financial ruin for their family. We met at a Panera near the hospital where he went for treatments every other week. He was already sitting in the corner booth when I walked in, wearing a Duke sweatshirt that hung loose on his thin frame and drinking what looked like his 4th coffee based on the empty cups beside him. When I sat down, he immediately said, "You know you don't have to do this. Someone slowly suffocating from their own lungs isn't exactly marriage material." But there was something about the way he said it without self-pity, just stating facts like he was reading a weather report, that made me want to prove him wrong. We talked for 3 hours that first meeting, and he explained how CF made breathing feel like drowning in slow motion, and how the meds kept him functional enough to work remotely as a graphic designer. We got married at the courthouse 2 weeks later with his sister and my best friend as witnesses, wearing jeans and sneakers because he said wearing a suit for a business transaction felt weird. The arrangement worked perfectly for 8 months as we lived completely separate lives in my 2-bedroom apartment. He took the guest room and turned it into his treatment center with his Vest therapy machine and nebulizers and rows of medication bottles organized by time of day. I kept my master bedroom, and we crossed paths mainly in the kitchen where we developed this elaborate dance of who used the coffee maker when and whose groceries went on which shelves. He worked his design contracts from the dining table surrounded by medication alarms, while I went to the office every day, coming home to find sticky notes with surprisingly good dad jokes stuck to random surfaces. He paid exactly half the rent and utilities, never missing a payment even when hospital stays cut into his income. We attended exactly 2 work events together to maintain appearances, where he charmed everyone by designing napkin sketches of my coworkers as cartoon characters. The insurance covered everything, including the new gene therapy medication that actually helped him gain weight and reduced his lung infections from monthly to quarterly. Then he got Pseudomonas pneumonia, and everything changed completely. I came home from work to find him collapsed in the hallway, wheezing so hard his whole body shook, and his lips had turned this terrifying shade of blue. The ambulance ride blurred together, but I remember holding his hand while he tried to joke that this wasn't how he planned to test the insurance coverage, between gasps that sounded like drowning. They kept him in the ICU for 6 days, where I learned what real fear felt like watching oxygen numbers drop while machines screamed warnings. I called in sick to work and basically lived in that hospital chair, learning his medication schedule and fighting with doctors who wanted to discharge him too early. When they finally let him come home, he could barely walk 10 feet without stopping to catch his breath. I moved my laptop to the living room and worked from home for 3 weeks, helping him with his treatments every 4 hours, including the middle of the night ones. I learned how to pound on his back to break up the mucus while he coughed until he gagged, and memorized which medications needed food and which ones made him nauseous. Somewhere between holding the basin while he threw up at 3 in the morning and watching him struggle through physical therapy exercises, I realized I'd started caring about him as more than just a roommate with a health condition. He started leaving me elaborate thank you notes hidden in my work bag with silly drawings of superheroes labeled "you," fighting villains labeled "insurance companies." When he finally got strong enough to cook again, he made me elaborate dinners, saying he needed to practice his knife skills for his eventual return to independence. One night, he designed a fake movie poster of us as action heroes called "Insurance Fraud: A Love Story" that made me laugh so hard I cried. But the pneumonia had damaged his lungs worse than before, and his good days became less frequent, his treatments more intensive, his energy fading faster each afternoon. I found him one morning sitting on the bathroom floor after a coughing fit that left blood specks on the white tiles, and he looked up at me with exhausted eyes and said, "Grace, you didn't sign up for this level of mess." Standing there watching him struggle to breathe, knowing this was his reality forever, knowing it would probably get worse, I couldn't stop myself from saying, "Charlie, I think I accidentally fell in love with you, and I don't know what to do about it." His eyes went wide and he just stared at me for what felt like hours, while his chest heaved with each rough breath. The blood spots on the tiles looked darker under the bathroom light, and I grabbed some toilet paper to wipe them up. Charlie watched me clean, and then said real quiet that he thought maybe he loved me too, but he was scared of what that meant. We sat there on the cold bathroom floor, while his breathing slowly got better, and neither of us knew what to say next. I helped him stand up when his legs stopped shaking, and we went to our separate rooms without talking about it. The next morning, Charlie was already making coffee when I came into the kitchen, and his hand touched mine when he passed me my mug. We both felt that spark, but pulled away fast, and he said, "Maybe we should just keep things normal while we figured this out." I nodded and went to set up my laptop for work while he started his morning breathing treatments. 3 days later, I got an email from HR about our yearly dependent check where they needed proof of our marriage within 30 days. The timing felt like some kind of cosmic joke, and I forwarded it to Charlie with just a question mark. He sent back a drawing of 2 stick figures drowning in a mountain of paperwork, which made me laugh even though nothing felt funny. His pulmonology appointment was that Thursday, and I drove him because he'd been too tired to drive himself lately. The doctor ran all the usual tests and then told us his lung function had dropped another 8% since the pneumonia. She mentioned we should start thinking about getting evaluated for a transplant, and Charlie went completely quiet. On the drive home, he stared out the window and didn't say anything until we got to our apartment. That night, I found him on his laptop looking up survival rates for lung transplants and clicking through medical journals. I started cooking dinner while he did his evening treatments, and for the first time, we sat at the table together instead of eating separately. He told me about this logo he was designing for a startup, and I talked about a project at work. This felt like what normal couples did, sharing boring details over spaghetti, and it made my chest hurt with wanting more. But over the next few days, Charlie started pulling back again and making jokes about being a bad investment for anyone's feelings. He kept reminding me that CF only gets worse and asked if I really understood what I was signing up for. I told him I'd been cleaning up his blood and mucus for weeks, so yeah, I knew exactly what this was. The insurance company denied one of his antibiotics the next week, saying they needed more documentation of medical necessity. We spent 3 hours on the phone with the case manager while I learned to speak their language about step therapy and prior authorizations. Charlie drew me as a superhero fighting a giant insurance monster while we were on hold for the 5th time. My best friend came over that weekend and pulled me into my bedroom to ask when I'd last done something just for myself. She said I looked exhausted and made me promise to set some boundaries, but we both knew I wouldn't. Charlie's arms were getting weaker, and I started helping him hold the vest for his therapy sessions. My hands were on his chest, feeling the vibrations that were supposed to break up the mucus in his lungs. He joked that this was the worst massage ever, but his eyes were soft when he looked up at me. We sat down with our budget spreadsheet to figure out how many overtime hours I needed to cover all the co-pays and out-of-pocket costs. Charlie insisted he could take on more design work, even though we both knew he barely had energy for his current projects. We opened a joint savings account and labeled it Next Hospital Stay Fund because we both knew it was coming. The whole time we were doing this dance around what we'd admitted in the bathroom, not talking about it but feeling it in every small moment. I'd catch him looking at me while I worked from home and he'd quickly look away. He started leaving me more elaborate drawings hidden around the apartment, silly cartoons that made me smile. One night he made dinner for both of us. This complicated pasta dish that took him 2 hours because he had to keep stopping to catch his breath. We ate it together and talked about everything except the thing we both were thinking about. His sister called to check on him and I heard him tell her things were fine, that I was helping out a lot. She must have said something because he looked at me and said no. We were just roommates, just the insurance thing. Charlie's opening line about not being marriage material while drowning in coffee cups is peak dark humor meets meet cute energy. This whole setup reads like a romantic comedy written by someone who really understands medical billing codes and tissue boxes. But after he hung up, he couldn't meet my eyes and went to his room early. I lay in bed that night thinking about how this started as a simple arrangement to save his life, and now I couldn't imagine my life without him in it. 3 weeks later, we were getting ready for my company's holiday party, and Charlie came out of his room wearing an actual button-down shirt instead of his usual hoodie. The hotel ballroom was packed with people I'd worked with for years, but when we walked in together, something felt different about how they looked at us. My manager's wife pulled me aside near the dessert table and said we seemed so natural together, not like newlyweds at all, more like we'd been married for years. Charlie's hand found mine under the table during dinner, and stayed there while my coworker from accounting kept touching his arm and laughing at everything he said. I felt this hot spike of something in my chest watching her lean into him, and Charlie must have noticed because he shifted closer to me and started drawing little circles on my palm with his thumb. The pretending was getting harder when every touch felt real, and every smile meant something more than just playing a part. 2 days after the party, I came home to find Charlie sitting at the kitchen table staring at an official-looking envelope from the insurance company. The dependent eligibility audit notice required joint bank statements, lease agreements showing both names, photos together, and signed affidavits from friends confirming our relationship was legitimate. My stomach dropped reading the section about potential fraud charges and prosecution for false claims that could result in fines up to $250,000. We spent the next 3 days scrambling to gather proof of a life we'd kept deliberately separate, realizing our careful boundaries made us look exactly like what we were. Charlie suggested we take some photos together, so we set up his camera in the living room and spent an afternoon staging couple shots that felt both completely fake and painfully real. His sister agreed to write an affidavit about our relationship after Charlie called and explained the situation in vague terms that made it sound like routine paperwork. We opened a joint checking account and transferred money back and forth to create a transaction history, feeling like criminals manufacturing evidence of a marriage that existed only on paper. The following week, Charlie had his regular 6-minute walk test at the pulmonary clinic, and his oxygen levels dropped below 90 even, with the portable tank turned up to 4 liters. The respiratory therapist adjusted his settings again and ordered a new concentrator for the apartment, while Charlie joked that he was becoming more machine than man. I saw his hands shake as he signed the equipment receipt and noticed how he had to sit down twice just walking from the exam room to the parking garage. That night, I brought up the transplant evaluation program I'd researched, and Charlie shut down completely, refusing to even look at the information I'd printed. I pushed too hard about making appointments and scheduling the initial screening, and he accused me of trying to control everything just like his parents used to. We slept in separate rooms for the first time since his pneumonia, and I lay there listening to him cough alone all night through the thin wall between us. The next morning, another prior authorization denial came for his nebulizer medication, and I spent 4 hours on the phone citing their own coverage policies back at them. I'd learned their system now, knew exactly which phrases triggered approvals and which review boards to request, and Charlie watched from the couch as I navigated their bureaucracy like a second language. When I finally got the override approval, he said I'd become fluent in insurance company bullshit, and there was something soft in his eyes that made my chest tight. My friend texted about her birthday dinner that weekend, but I was too exhausted to pretend everything was fine when Charlie was having more bad days than good ones. He noticed me declining the invitation and tried to convince me to go, said he'd be fine alone for a few hours, but I couldn't leave when his breathing was so labored he couldn't even make it to the kitchen without stopping. The isolation felt like another symptom of his disease, cutting us off from the world outside our apartment full of medical equipment and medication schedules. HR scheduled a meeting the following Monday to discuss the audit timeline and what would happen if we couldn't provide sufficient proof of our marriage. They explained coverage could be suspended during the investigation period, and benefits wouldn't be reinstated until the review board made a determination, which could take up to 90 days. Charlie reached over and squeezed my hand under the conference table while I tried to keep my voice steady, asking about the appeals process. That night, Charlie's anxiety about the audit kept him awake past 2 in the morning, so I brought my laptop into his room and we watched old sitcoms together. We carefully maintained space between us on his bed, but somewhere around the 3rd episode, he fell asleep and rolled toward me, his head ending up on my shoulder. I stayed perfectly still, listening to his labored breathing, memorizing the rattling sound his lungs made and the way his hand curled against my arm. 3 nights later, I woke up to Charlie calling my name from the bathroom and found him hunched over the sink with blood splattered across the white porcelain. We drove to the emergency room with him focusing on breathing while I handled the registration forms we both knew by heart now. The triage nurse commented that we worked well together like a practice team, and something about that simple observation made my throat close up. They admitted him for observation and started IV antibiotics, while we settled into our familiar routine of me in the visitor chair and him in the hospital bed making dark jokes about frequent flyer miles. The social worker knocked on the door around noon with a clipboard, and that practice smile they all have when they're about to suggest something you don't want to hear. She pulled up a chair and started talking about caregiver burnout, while watching me pick at the cafeteria sandwich I'd been holding for 20 minutes without eating. I kept saying I was fine. We had a system. Everything was under control. But she left a stack of pamphlets on the bedside table anyway, with titles about compassion fatigue and support groups for spouses of chronically ill patients. patients. Charlie found them later while I was in the bathroom, and when I came back, he was staring at the ceiling with that look he gets when he's adding something else to his list of things he feels guilty about. 3 days after they discharged him, we sat at the kitchen table with a lawyer from Legal Aid filling out advance directive forms, checking boxes about ventilators and feeding tubes and DNR orders while our coffee got cold. Charlie held my hand under the table while explaining exactly what he wanted if things got bad, making me promise not to let them keep him alive just because the insurance would pay for it, and something about the way he squeezed my fingers when he said it made my chest hurt worse than watching him struggle to breathe. We spent the next few weeks doing this weird dance around each other where we'd catch ourselves staring and then look away, where his hand would brush mine reaching for something and we'd both freeze, where the air between us felt charged with something neither of us wanted to name. Then one afternoon, when his oxygen levels were actually decent for once, he pulled me down next to him on the couch and kissed me, and it tasted like his nebulizer medication and felt like everything clicking into place at once. We sat there afterwards trying to figure out what we were doing, both agreeing it was probably stupid and complicated and definitely not what we planned, but neither of us could pretend we didn't want this anymore. The next morning hit me with this wave of panic about what we'd started, thinking about how much harder it would be to lose him if I let myself really love him, and Charlie must have seen it on my face because he suggested we take things slow. I pointed out we were already married and living together, so slow seemed kind of relative, which made him laugh until he started coughing, and we ended up agreeing to just see what happened without putting labels on anything. 2 weeks later, the insurance company called to schedule a home visit for their audit, wanting to verify we were actually living as a married couple, and we spent an entire evening going over each other's details like we were studying for a test. Charlie kept making jokes about how most of our actual truth would sound fake anyway, like who would believe we got married for insurance and then accidentally fell in love, but I could tell he was nervous about them finding some reason to deny coverage. My manager started pushing back hard about my work from home requests, pulling me into her office to say it was affecting team dynamics, and making other people pick up my slack, even though I'd been getting all my work done at weird hours between treatments. HR explained the Family Medical Leave Act options, but that meant unpaid time, and we couldn't afford to lose my income on top of everything else, so I started setting my alarm for 4 in the morning to do his treatments before driving to the office. The transplant evaluation day meant 12 hours at the medical center going through every test they could think of, blood work and lung function and psychological assessments where they asked Charlie how he felt about potentially dying on the waiting list. We learned his lung allocation score put him right in the middle of the list, sick enough to need new lungs. Photo shoots for fake marriages require Oscar-worthy performances, but watching Charlie draw circles on her palm while fending off handsy coworkers suggests their acting skills might be getting too good for their own safety, but not sick enough to jump ahead of people actively dying, and the coordinator explained most people in his category waited 18 months to 2 years if they got them at all. The insurance approved the evaluation costs, but immediately put a prior authorization hold on the anti-rejection medications he'd need after any transplant. And the coordinator handed us another stack of paperwork for pharmaceutical assistance programs like this was just normal, like everyone had to beg drug companies for help staying alive. We had our first real fight when I suggested we should tell our families we were together for real now, with Charlie insisting we keep it private, because he didn't want outside opinions ruining what we had, and I understood his need to control something, but it still hurt feeling like we were some shameful secret. My best friend showed up at our door the next Saturday with 6 bags of groceries, and wouldn't leave when I tried to send her away, just started unpacking frozen meals into our freezer, while telling me I looked like death warmed over and needed to take a nap. She practically forced me into bed and sat with Charlie while I slept, and I woke up 3 hours later to hear them laughing in the living room, looking at his sketch pad where he'd drawn her as a superhero, fighting off giant insurance forms with a sword made of casseroles. That night after my friend left, Charlie dragged his oxygen tank into the kitchen and insisted on helping me make pasta, even though standing made him breathe harder. He sat on a stool chopping tomatoes while I boiled water, then grabbed my hand when his phone started playing some old song I didn't know. We shuffled around the tiny kitchen space, his oxygen tubing wrapping around my legs twice before we gave up laughing. He kept the tank on his back like a weird backpack and spun me slowly near the stove. The pasta water boiled over while we were dancing and made a huge mess on the burner. 3 days later, the doorbell rang at 8 in the morning, and a woman with a clipboard stood there saying she was from the insurance company. She walked through our apartment taking photos of everything, stopping at the guest room where Charlie's medical stuff filled every surface. "Why do you maintain separate bedrooms if you're married?" she asked while writing notes that she wouldn't let me see. Charlie wheeled his oxygen tank over and showed her his medication schedule, pointing out the 4 a.m. breathing treatments and the vest therapy that shook the whole bed. She took more photos of his pill organizers and the nebulizer collection and asked why we didn't have wedding photos displayed. We scrambled after she left, moving half of Charlie's clothes into my closet, even though they smelled like medicine. I pulled books from his shelves and mixed them with mine, making it look like we actually shared the space. We printed photos from those 2 work events and stuck them on the fridge and bought matching coffee mugs that said Mr. and Mrs. Charlie found a frame at the thrift store and put in that fake movie poster he'd drawn of us as action heroes. The apartment started looking like a real married couple lived there, instead of 2 people avoiding their feelings. 2 weeks later, Charlie woke up with a fever of 103, and his cough sounded different, wet and rattling in a way that scared me. The ER doctor said he had Pseudomonas again, but this time it was resistant to the usual antibiotics. They put in a PICC line, this long tube that went into a vein in his arm and ended near his heart for IV medications. I had to learn to flush it with saline and connect the antibiotic bags that hung from a pole in our living room. Every 8 hours, I'd put on gloves and clean the connection site with alcohol wipes before hooking up the new bag. Charlie kept apologizing for turning me into a nurse, but I told him to stop being stupid about it. The antibiotics made him throw up constantly, and I held the bucket while he heaved nothing but bile. One night at 2 a.m., his alarm went off for treatments, and I was so tired I grabbed the wrong medication vial. Charlie saw me drawing it up and yelled, "That's the wrong one," louder than I'd ever heard him yell. I dropped the syringe and yelled back that maybe he should do it himself if I was so useless. We both ended up crying on the bathroom floor, him from frustration and me from exhaustion and fear. He said this was harder than he thought it would be, and I said no kidding while we held each other. The next morning, a letter came from the insurance company saying our case was under review pending investigation, which meant they could cut us off anytime. Charlie started taking half doses of some medications to stretch them out, which made his breathing worse, but he wouldn't stop. I caught him cutting pills in half and hiding the extras in a shoebox like we were drug dealers or something. The transplant team called with good news that he was approved for the lung transplant list, but then insurance denied coverage for one of the anti-rejection meds he'd need. We spent hours on the phone with the drug company and got approved for their assistance program, but only for 3 months. Every small win felt like it came with 2 new problems attached to it. HR called me into a meeting where they said coverage would continue during the investigation, but my job might be at risk if fraud was proven. My manager sat there looking uncomfortable while the HR lady explained that insurance fraud was a fireable offense that could include prosecution. Charlie offered to divorce me that night to protect my job, and I told him if he ever suggested that again, I'd throw his oxygen tank out the window. We decided to tell his sister and my friend the truth about our feelings, since we needed people who knew what was really happening. They came over for dinner and Charlie held my hand while I explained how things had changed between us. His sister laughed and said, "Finally," because apparently the way I looked at him in the ICU gave everything away. My friend worried we'd made everything too complicated, but agreed to be our support system through whatever came next. That night, Charlie asked if he could sleep in my room since his back hurt from the hospital bed mattress in the guest room. We figured out how to arrange his oxygen concentrator on my nightstand and ran the tubing under the blanket so it wouldn't tangle. He had to stop twice to catch his breath just from walking down the hall to my room. We lay there carefully, not touching it first. Then he reached over and pulled me against his chest. The nebulizer alarm went off at midnight right when we were finally falling asleep, and we both laughed at how not romantic this was. He did his treatment sitting on my bed while I rubbed his back through the vest vibrations. We learned to work around the medical stuff, planning everything around treatment schedules and energy levels. Some nights he was too sick and slept in the guest room. Other nights we managed to pretend we were a normal couple. The oxygen tubing got caught in my hair one morning and yanked the cannula right off his face when I rolled over. We both laughed about it, but the next morning Charlie sat at the kitchen table with 2 yellow legal pads and said we needed to write stuff down in case something happened. He started his letter with all his computer passwords and design client contact info, while I wrote down every insurance code and doctor's phone number I'd memorized over the past year. After the practical stuff he kept writing, and I saw him wipe his eyes twice before he folded the paper and sealed it in an envelope with my name on it. I sealed mine too, and we put them in the filing cabinet with the insurance paperwork, both of us pretending we'd never need to open them. 3 days later at his pulmonologist appointment, the doctor pulled up Charlie's lung function charts on her computer screen and showed us how he was right on the edge of qualifying for the transplant list. She said if his numbers dropped even 2%, he'd move to active status, but if they improved slightly, he'd stay on the waiting list, which could mean years. Charlie committed to doing physical therapy every single day, even though the exercises left him gasping and shaking, and I learned to count his breaths per minute to track if he was getting worse. The physical therapist came to our apartment twice a week and made Charlie blow into this plastic thing that measured his lung capacity while I wrote down the numbers in a notebook. Some days he could barely get the ball halfway up the tube, and other days he'd manage 3/4, and we started living for those tiny improvements. I filed for intermittent family medical leave at work, which meant they couldn't fire me for taking time off for Charlie's appointments, but also meant I only got paid for the hours I actually worked. The first time we fought about money was when the rent was due, and I had to cover his half because he'd missed too many design deadlines during his last hospital stay. He threw his wallet at the wall and said he wasn't worth bankrupting myself over, and I threw mine right back and told him to stop being dramatic. We sat on opposite sides of the apartment for 2 hours before he came over and showed me a spreadsheet he'd made of every medical expense and how we could cut costs on groceries and cancel streaming services to make it work. 4 months after starting the appeals process for his new nebulizer medication, we finally got the approval letter in the mail. Charlie framed it and hung it next to his computer with a post-it note that said, "Grace's 147th phone call victory," even though we both knew those hours on hold with insurance reps were hours I'd never get back. The medicine cost $12,000 a month and now they'd cover it, which felt huge even though it was just keeping him at the same level, not making him better. Then the manila envelope from the insurance company arrived with final audit determination stamped on the front. Picture this: 2 people slow dancing around medical equipment while pasta water creates its own kitchen disaster. Truly the height of romance when your dance partner's wearing an oxygen tank like the world's worst fashion accessory. My hands shook opening it and Charlie had to read it out loud because my eyes wouldn't focus on the words. They couldn't prove fraud, but they also couldn't verify our marriage was legitimate. So they were offering us the option to sign an affidavit under penalty of perjury, stating our marriage was real and not for insurance purposes. We had 72 hours to decide whether to sign it and risk federal charges or refuse and potentially lose coverage. The hospital social worker got us an appointment with a couples counselor through their support program, and we sat on her beige couch listing every single fear we had. Charlie said he was scared of dying and leaving me with legal problems, scared of living and watching me give up my whole life for his treatments, scared of getting better only to get sick again. I said I was scared of fraud charges, scared of him dying, scared of bankruptcy, scared of losing him either to his lungs or to him deciding I deserved better. The counselor didn't try to make us feel better, just sat there while we cried and held each other and admitted we had no idea what we were doing. 2 days before the deadline, Charlie woke up feeling good enough to walk without his oxygen tank. We made it to the corner coffee shop and sat outside for 20 minutes while he drew cartoon versions of us as superheroes on a napkin, me with a phone destroying insurance companies and him with lungs made of steel. An old couple at the next table smiled at us like we were just another young couple in love, not 2 people facing federal fraud investigations and terminal illness. I kept that napkin in my wallet even though we both knew these good days were happening less and less often. On the morning of the deadline, we sat at the kitchen table with the affidavit between us. Charlie signed first, his signature shaky but clear, then pushed it to me. I signed my name under his and we put it in the envelope together, knowing we were choosing each other over safety, over logic, over the fear of losing everything. We walked to the post office holding hands, mailed the envelope, and came home to do his treatments like any other day, except now we'd admitted on federal documents that our marriage was real, which meant admitting that love wasn't enough to fix anything, but we were choosing it anyway. Sounds like we've been through quite a ride today just trying to piece things together. Thanks for hanging out with me and sharing in the curiosity. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.